thank you for having me, first and foremost, because this is a special space in which to think together, so I really like the Think Lab. I'm going to try to make it dialogic and not a kind of very upfront lecture that you have to listen to the end. I do not have a climactic point to come to. I do not have the answers or a conclusion that we all should reach, because that would not be post-colonial at all. So basically, the play on the post-colonial and the theme of the Think Lab, the temporalities of rupture and continuity, I thought is a perfect opportunity to juggle around some thoughts on temporalities, but also about the misunderstandings that are still associated with what it means to be post-colonial, or what post-colonial studies is actually doing in terms of studying. Because you'd think that a lot of that has been addressed, so why should we even have to tackle it again? But it's not so clear that it's not sometimes understood literally, in terms of the post in post-colonialism, rather than as a endeavor that deals with legacies of colonial rule even before independence. But I'll get into that shortly. Now, my title, We Have Never Been Postcolonial, sounds very much like it's a play on Bruno Latour's We Have Never Been Modern, and obviously I can't say it has no connection to it, but I'm not interested in kind of agreeing with Latour. If I agreed with him at all, it would rather be to say we have never been modern because there's no modernity without coloniality, but not because of what he considers to be part of modernity. What I'm rather interested in doing here is answering the question that Stuart Hall was asking in 2002 in his essay, When Was the Postcolonial? And basically asking also the subsequent question, what should be included and excluded from its frame? And so in the essay, Stuart Hall, starting with the question, when was the postcolonial and what should be included and excluded, starts, and this is more than 20 years ago, but still, with the statement, if postcolonial time is the time after colonialism, and colonialism is defined in terms of the binary division between the colonizers and the colonized, why is post-colonial time also a time of difference? But it's rather surprising that given the debates, at least from the 90s, as to whether or not post-colonialism is the time after colonialism, we should still be discussing this question today. When I talk to my students or introduce the post-colonial perspective, I always there's at least one person here who knows this very well because she has taught it herself. When I talk to them about postcolonialism, I differentiate between two dimensions, and I say, yes, there was this understanding of postcolonialism as a time concept, the time after colonialism, but it has been pretty much and pretty quickly debunked by people like Ella Shuhat, Arif Dirlik, already at the beginning of the 90s, saying, no, this is not what it's meant. It's actually a way of studying the legacies of colonial rule. It has to do with issues of identity, identity building, what happens during the struggle for independence and after, but it does not kind of mean that you have to be independent in order to be in a post-colonial time. Nevertheless, starting from a linear understanding of colonialism and post-colonial rule, we would know that even without theoretical arguments, a mere temporal location of the post-colonial would not work, even if we just think about the ambiguous timeline that is being created regarding different moments of independence. So post-colonialism as a term that had something to do with administrative decolonization after World War II was seen to apply primarily to the majority of colonies achieving independence in the wake of World War II and up until the 70s in Africa and Asia. But that already makes the Latin American independences in the 19th century kind of either anachronistic or, if you want to put it positively, post-colonial avant la lettre, because there was no talk of postcolonialism then, it was just Latin America. And the part that I want to deal with in more detail today is the other part of the ambiguous timeline, the territories that are still not independent today. So how can we be post-colonial in a temporal sense if territories in the Caribbean, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean are still occupied today? Of course, the language of colonialism is not used, at least in official parlance, to refer to them, because, first of all, it's not socially and politically desirable, but historically, most of these territories have never even changed occupying hands. They're still under the rule of the same kind of European state that first colonized them. So the fact that the name changed and they're called overseas territories and departments does not mean that they're not colonies. If we talk about how the population living in these territories perceives their own status, they would very much say, and sometimes do say explicitly, this is what it means to be a colony of Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and so on. Now, I've talked a bit about the first part of the title, We Have Never Been Postcolonial, and hinted at a still kind of temporal understanding of the post and postcolonialism. I haven't told you what I mean by theoretically inconvenient times, and this is something that is a direct play on words that have been used with respect to the Caribbean by US anthropologist Sidney Mintz, when he discusses actually transnationalism and saying, I would like to pluck a story from Caribbean history in order to suggest that the region may have been more transnational than it looks, and that it may have become so at a theoretically inconvenient time, which is to say, long ago rather than last year. This is from an article called The Localization of Anthropological Practice from Area Studies to Transnationalism, where Mintz is actually interested in showing how the Caribbean is not an exotic place. It's not an exception in an otherwise differently positioned and in a differently linear kind of evolution placed territory, but it is not then exotic or historically particular, but it encompassed many transnational transborder processes, many transnational entanglements at a time when there was no vocabulary for it. Especially Europe, but also the US, if we want to talk about Western social sciences, had not discovered transnationality and transregionality as something that is relevant to them, which of course, again, also happened primarily in the wake of World War II with the administrative decolonization, with high migration flows or huge migration flows from Africa and Asia to the former metropoles, which looked like transnationality is only starting to happen. This is not true, but we're not going to talk about transnationality primarily here, but about the theoretically inconvenient time. So with this, I want to make a case for how the Caribbean that Mintz focuses on, but that also I have been interested in primarily as the microcosm from which the global capitalist system was forged, gives us a series of lessons of thinking about temporality, and also uncovers several of the misunderstandings that are connected normally to how new the transnational, the postcolonial, the transregional, or even the global are. And spoiler alert, none of that is new. It's theoretically inconvenient to have all of this in the Caribbean in the 16th, 17th, 18th century before there is a theoretical interest and a theoretical engagement in the core of the capitalist system with these issues. This is what creates exoticism. This is what makes a place that does not fit existing theories kind of fall through the cracks of being theoretically interesting for one discipline or another, for one field or the other. So my claim here is that the Caribbean basically unsettles multiple temporalities, and the very prominent engagement with the region has stemmed first from migration studies, transnational studies of migration, Nina Glick-Schiller being one prominent author who has spoken about and from the region as an important one to discuss transnationalism, starts, and so do others, from the Caribbean as the basis for most transnational studies, because it was not only the first region to be colonized by Europe in 1492, and characterized by, if you want to put it very broadly, the supply and demand of labor force after that time, starting with the trade in enslaved Africans, but has been the location of massive imports of labor migrants throughout its history up until independence, from the systematic trade that did start in the 16th century, but became systematic and achieved its peak, so to say, in the 18th century, to the indentured laborers coming mostly from Asia after the abolition of slavery. And when I discuss this with my students, again, I show this map. I'm very fond of maps. That really visualize a story that we do not talk about much when we talk about global entanglements, transnationality, even globalization, a word that I don't like to use because it's mostly ahistorically kind of employed. And this map from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database shows not only the direction and basically breaking down the movement of people who were trafficked from Africa to the Americas, but also it explicitly zooms in on the Caribbean to show the number of people that reached one region with respect to its geographical expanse. That really actually paints a picture of how, so here the thickness of the arrows is related to the number of people being transported from one continent to the other. And if you look at the geographical expanse of the Caribbean versus the geographical expanse of North and South America, the fact that it was almost 50% of all people trafficked from Africa that reached the Caribbean, such a small region, paints a picture of the demographic upheaval and of the actually momentous consequences that this process had. And also because I said it has to be a bit dialogical, I also always ask my students if we have any idea of how many people we're talking about. This map is supposed to be from 1500 to 1900 because slavery was abolished last in 1888 in Brazil. But any idea how many people we're talking about that were trafficked from Africa to the Americas? This is a question that I learned to ask myself because Mintz asks it in his 1998 article, and I realized I had no idea about that number. I had no idea about the number of the world population at the time, because you have to somehow relate it to it so that it's believable. And in order to measure it or to put it together with transnational processes today, you have to have some basis for comparison. But if that is a complete black box that you cannot begin to understand, there's no way to actually think historically. Yeah? So that
5 million.
5 million? Okay. Oh, because it's on the, does it say 5 million? Yeah, but it's just the legend. Yeah? Oh. That is very concrete, and that's actually the consensus that historians have reached right now, although everyone, pretty much everyone agrees that it's a very, very, very conservative estimate. But if we're talking about, especially in the 16th, actually up to the 19th century, was there not 1 billion people on Earth? The fact that you have such a huge movement of people across continents systematically, it wasn't a one-time thing, it was systematically across continents involving a huge number of people related to the population of the world at the time. The question is whether we should be talking about the global, the transnational, the transregional there. Now, we can't talk about the transnational before there are nations. So obviously what was happening with the transatlantic slave trade is not in any way transnational, because not only had the Americas or Africa no nation states, but neither did Europe. So the transnational itself is an anachronistic, kind of ahistorical reference that wants to encompass every movement across continents. If we only want to talk about the transnational as something new, then, of course, it relates to a time after the emergence of nation states. But then we have something else here that is very early and has not been captured by the terminology of the trans-regional or global entanglement, because the region was trans-regional and global at a time that was theoretically inconvenient for these questions. These were not questions being asked. And the same goes for an understanding of the modernity, as the Caribbean had for a long time served as a paradigmatic contrast to the modern, the wage labor, the industrial being kind of played out in Europe. And so on the one hand, the enslaved African labor, that was the majority of the labor force in the Caribbean, and European wage labor were being seen as kind of, on the one hand, the archaic way of inefficient labor and underdeveloped that you want to leave behind when reaching a modern industrial developed capitalist society, and kind of an inefficient mode of work that had to do with this other of Europe, with the fact that it's the absolute negative contrast to developed and especially free labor force. Now, the fact that it's the other way around, that there's no free labor, there's no wage labor, there's no industrialization in Europe without the resources depleted from the Caribbean under the plantation economy, under slavery. They are so cheap and profitable for Europe because slavery means that the enslaved people do not get paid, was left out of this discussion. But even the inefficiency and the archaic mode of labor on the plantation has been debunked as, actually ideologically biased. People like Philip McMichael have shown how Caribbean plantation systems were not only modern agro-industrial enterprises where there was a strict division of labor, there was a supervision of the division of tasks. It was actually the industrial model played on an agro-industrial enterprise with a lot of skill involved, especially if we think of the refinement of sugar. That is a highly difficult process for which a lot of skill was necessary. But also that, of course, the fact that it was even played out was linked to consumption patterns and industrialization in Europe. Again, here, Mintz has this analogy by saying the proletarian in England and the enslaved on the plantation were linked through the fact that one was producing weapons and handcuffs while the other was shipping sugar and rum. So the sugar and rum, and then if we think about the colonization of Asia, the tea, make the tea o'clock of the industrial laborer, something that in later work Sidney Mintz comes back to when he becomes a food anthropologist, and says it was only possible to give the industrial laborer a feeling of going to bed with a full belly because they could be fed calorie-free foods produced under colonial rule, like sweetened tea. It doesn't make you satisfied, it's not nutritious, but it gives you the impression that you have a full belly because it's warm, and it's cheap because it's produced under slavery. But it is so inextricably linked to industrial labor that dividing the two is absolutely mind-boggling from the point of view of a world in which these phenomena were actually inseparable. And obviously, a lot of capital was thus transferred to the metropole. So we have here, again, before national or nation states, national structures, we have transcontinental entanglements, again, something else that the Caribbean unsettles in terms of temporality. And something that I very much like with respect to how the Caribbean is studied is the way Haitian anthropologist Michel Roche-Trouillot discusses how come the Caribbean never fit in any of the prevailing social scientific engagements. And that is exactly actually what Mintz means when he says it was transnational, transregional, transcontinental at a theoretically inconvenient time. Because Trouillot says nobody wanted to deal with the Caribbean in anthropology because they were searching for the native and the primitive and the people's pre-contact. And there's no pre-contact in the Caribbean after basically 1492 anymore. So that is actually not interesting, or it's too messy for anthropologists to touch. Now, it's not Western enough for sociology because it's a 100% almost non-white population that was never planned as part of what sociology should deal with, because the discipline self-defined itself as the discipline of modern Western society. So how could you deal with a non-white society that is, well, maybe Western, but it's so Western that it falls out of the West again because it's not the West of Europe or the US. So it's not white or not Western enough for sociology, not native enough for anthropology, and at the same time, because of the entanglement in terms of demography, but also of labor regimes, of the former enslaved people, free people, indentured workers, it was multiracial, multilingual, stratified. Well, today we would call it multicultural. But again, theoretically inconvenient time. What possessed you to be multicultural before the West discovered the word? It's not convenient to be avant la lettre. So in that sense, the fact that the Caribbean is at the same time the last region to achieve partial independence in the 20th century is another way of kind of unsettling temporalities, because all of the other characteristics would point to a highly modern structure, a kind of highly modern setup, actually anticipation of everything that is being celebrated as global, as transnational, as desirable in that sense. But being non-sovereign, as most territories in the Caribbean are today, points in the other direction. Or does it? Does it mean that non-independent territories and being still colonized today is highly modern as well? Does it mean that we on the planet have never been post-colonial in any temporal sense? Because colonialism, not only in terms of its legacies, in terms of its impacts, but in terms of its very classic implementation, is not over yet. So how can we be post-colonial in any sense if even the administrative sense has not been overcome? Dealing with the way the Caribbean was kind of not fitting in any social science, Trouillot says, I find it very telling about the post-colonial avant la lettre, when he says, when E.B. Tyler, the father of anthropology, published the first general anthropology textbook in the English language in 1881, Barbados had been British for 2.5 centuries, Cuba had been Spanish for almost 4, and Haiti had been an independent state for 3 generations, after a long French century during which it accounted for more than half of its metropolis's foreign trade. These were hardly places to look for primitives. Their very existence questioned the West-non-West dichotomy and the category of the native, upon both of which anthropology was premised. Now, given that the region was post-colonial avant la lettre, and that today it still encompasses the majority of the territories still occupied by European states. This is a map of overseas countries and territories and outermost regions that included the territories of Britain before Brexit. So it's still 28 EU member states in 2020. And you can see from the territories that are marked with either a yellow or a blue star, these are territories that are somehow either integrated or associated to an EU territory, if we counted England to it or Great Britain to it. The blue stars are the ones that, just like the blue on the EU, on the continent itself, are integrated members of the European Union. They are part of the common market. If the European state that occupies them has the euro, so do they. That goes, for instance, for French Guiana in South America and for Martinique, Guadeloupe as well. That does not go for the British territories because Britain itself never had the euro. But the yellow territories are called associated territories to the EU, or overseas countries and territories. So the blue ones are outermost regions, the yellow ones are overseas countries and territories. Most of them are located in the Caribbean. Not all of them, so you occasionally hear, and maybe you have heard in the news recently about New Caledonia having lots of protests because of French legislation being changed so that people cannot vote for their own independence by themselves, but everyone who has lived on the territory for less than 10 years also qualifies for citizenship, which mostly means white French people who just moved there, so they would not vote for independence. But, or Mayotte, that's only in the Indian Ocean next to Madagascar, that just became a EU department in 2014 after a referendum because it was caught between choosing between Madagascar and France, and it had been a so-called protectorate of France for a number of years. Or maybe the Chago Islanders and Diego Garcia, something, big conflict it's part of the British Empire that has just been partly resolved by Britain saying it will give it back. Conditionally. Now, if we zoom in on the Caribbean as the region in which most colonized territories are present today. This is actually explicitated where you have the UK Virgin Islands, Anguilla belonging to the UK, Guadeloupe belonging to France, St. Eustatius to the Netherlands, and so on. This is a map that makes it clear how much of Europe is in the Caribbean, how much claims to Caribbean territories the EU has or European states have, to which the UK, of course, still counts. But it doesn't tell us anything about how to grapple with these realities because there is no vocabulary for it. Most of the time, and I've called this the coloniality of memory, there's a systematic omission of enduring colonial ties from public discourse on Europe. We never hear about Guadeloupe being European. We hear it about it being part of France. It's a French department. We hear about the EU space agency being located in French Guiana because its closeness to the tropics makes it easier to launch weather balloons or something, I'm not sure. But that's when you hear that something related to the EU starts from South America, or it doesn't, in case there are strikes in French Guiana, which kind of messes up EU politics. But you don't hear it as part of EU politics or being European. You hear it as a local problem. And so we get such labels as the Dutch Caribbean, the British West Indies, the French Antilles, and don't get me started on the British West Indies. There's so much wrong with the label that comes from the fact that Columbus got lost and thought he was in India. So that's the West Indies, because then they discovered the actual one is in the East. And then the British West Indies. So this is an imposition of everything that is not related to what is happening on the ground, to how people themselves feel or would locate themselves, or when they would locate themselves in relation to Europe, which is why I discussed this as part of Forgotten Europe. It is administratively, these are territories that are parts of European states. This is not claiming them from Europe again, but claiming that they could claim rights on behalf of being part of European states, but are mostly forgotten in the sense of actively forgotten from definitions of Europeanness. And there's also the systematic avoidance of any overarching classification of these current colonial territories as European. There is, however, a very clear and very easy way of reminding ourselves that they're there, and that is even in official EU politics. All of these territories have to be represented on EU maps. This is the official policy, so every time I talk to people when there are EU officials in the room, they're like, what, you sociologists didn't know that? We know that. Yeah, sure, these are European territories. We have to represent them. Okay, do you? Yes, we do, then I'm told, and then it's about them being represented on all euro banknotes, not just the 50, it's just the 50 represented there, but there's no discussion of how come France insisted that they should be represented on all EU banknotes, to such an extent that when the EU banknotes were first printed, and they were not on it, France insisted that this is not correct. All of French territory has to be printed on the banknotes, so they were pulled and reprinted. I don't know how much that cost, but now they're there on every single banknote, and the only one you can really recognize is French Guiana, because it's big enough to surface there, which is something that the European Central Bank also tells you. They're telling you very small islands are not shown on the banknotes because they cannot be accurately reproduced using high volume offset printing. So not big enough of a resolution on the EU banknote, no representation. So there's that. This is the bottom part of that website where the other territories, such as French Guiana, the Azores, Madeira, Guadeloupe, Martinique, Réunion, and the Canary Islands are at least identified on the banknotes. And of course, this is nowhere on the European Union website under EU history or definitions of Europeanness or representations of Europe. This is from the website of the European Central Bank, not under the rubric, how did the euro emerge and what do we connect with the European currency? No, it's under design elements. How did we design the euro banknote? Which is a way of representing, but not a way of taking seriously. So I've referred to Caribbean Europe as a way of claiming the right of colonized territories to have rights in the Caribbean as European territories, and defined it as all territories that were previously colonized by a European power and presently administered as dependencies of a EU member or of the UK post-Brexit. And this is the division I talked about before, the outermost regions. I'm going to just read them out because we don't hear these names often. Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and the French overseas community of Saint-Martin. And the overseas countries and territories, French Saint-Barthélemy, the British Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Montserrat, Turks and Caicos, Dutch, Aruba, Curaçao, Saint Martin, Bonaire, Saba, and Saint Eustatius. The fact that we have such a huge number of territories that encompass a significant enough population to become decisive, for instance, in French presidential elections, when there is a close call for who gets elected, and even if there's not, all the presidential candidates also campaign in the Caribbean and in Réunion and in Mayotte with a specific political agenda, of course, taxpayer financed. And if the election is a close one, then it very much matters how the Caribbean votes, how Réunion votes, how Mayotte votes. Not the other way around. When there's hurricanes, earthquakes, and all sorts of climate-related and not only catastrophes in the Caribbean, the response with respect to aid is very different. It's not systematic, it's not systematized. This was the case in 2017 most dramatically, because there it was clear how uncoordinated the EU response is in such cases. A lot of Caribbean territory was affected by the hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, but that was the time when Great Britain started discussing where the money should even come from. Should it come from the aid department, which is normally foreign aid, or should it come from the Ministry of the Interior, because these are their own territories? And the debate was taking place while people were waiting for clean water. France responded more quickly, but we have such examples as, I do not have the map here, but I can show this one. Anguilla and Saint Martin and Saint Martin are very close to each other. One is a UK island, the other one is divided between the Netherlands and France. So the fact that France was sending aid to Saint Martin, but the UK was not sending aid to Anguilla, meant that within a territory that spans 4 miles, some people were getting clean water, some weren't. And France refused aid from Cuba, which offered the minute the hurricanes happened to send aid to all kind of affected regions. And France said, if there will be aid, it will be French, which meant that, yes, they reacted more promptly than the UK, but not as quickly as Cuba would have. The Caribbean is also the place in which the most systematic and prominent calls for reparations for colonialism and slavery have been put forth 10 years ago already, but not much has happened in the sense of actually giving voice and giving suit to these demands, a full formal apology, a repatriation for those who want to return to Africa, a development program for indigenous peoples, technology transfer, an African knowledge program, and also very clearly and very specifically addressing the public health crisis as a form of reparation, including the still persisting impacts of kind of cross-generational impacts of coming from an enslaved population with all of the epigenetic trauma that is involved. If we talk about the temporality of decolonization and see that many examples of places still colonized in the Caribbean today, it still looks, and sometimes it is still discussed, as something that is just a matter of time. That still leaves us with the illusion that we're only years away or decades away from the actual destiny of independent sovereign nation states, which is not exactly what everyone has in mind. There is talk of non-sovereign futures in the Caribbean as something that would be more fitting. That means not only kind of asking for reparations, but not cutting ties with the former colonial power, and thus releasing the colonial power from responsibility, but for some formal payment, but actually actively involving them in kind of all sorts of, for instance, infrastructure and education projects. I'd like to end on a cheerful note, but actually the last developments with respect to Chago Island showed me that we still have a lot or a long way to go. This is from a political analyst from France who thought that an appropriate tweet to the announcement that the British will give back Chago would be, with the UK set to lose Chago in the Indian Ocean, the sun will soon finally set on the British Empire, which is, you know, kind of funny if you think about it, and especially with a French political analyst again poking fun at the arch enemy Britain. But that was not his point. His actual point was, but the sun will never set on the French Republic, which was not meant as a joke. It is still on and off being celebrated by different kind of even educational organizations by saying, did you know that France still has as many time zones as it did during colonial rule? Yes, it does. And that says something about not only kind of temporality of decolonization, but very hands-on geopolitical interests. The reason why France will not kind of let go of many of these territories are very practical matters, such as fishing rights, very practical matters, such as the production of nickel, which is something that is extremely important. And if France loses New Caledonia, it's afraid that China and the US will take over that kind of production. And so it's still very much, very classically hands-on colonial rule. So I'm afraid we have never been postcolonial, and the temporality of the postcolonials is still with us, despite the debunking of the post not being about the after. Thank you.